Today we're going over three of the most epic deaths in history. And when I say epic, I don't mean he lived a long life and peacefully passed away. I'm talking about deaths involving kings, warriors, battles, impossible situations, and moments so dramatic they sound like they were written for a movie. These are real historical figures, real battles, real events. Although some ancient stories contain details that historians debate, the people and major events we're talking about are firmly rooted in history. And we're starting with number 3, Archimedes. Archimedes was one of the greatest minds of the ancient world. He was a mathematician, an engineer, an inventor, and apparently a man who could become so focused on a problem that even an invading army couldn't get his attention. He lived in the Greek city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. At the time, Syracuse was one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean. It was wealthy, it was powerful, and it was strategically located in the middle of a massive struggle between Rome and Carthage. During the Second Punic War, Syracuse found itself caught between two enormous powers, Rome and Carthage. Syracuse eventually sided against Rome, and Rome wasn't exactly known for politely accepting rejection. So in 214 BC, the Romans began a massive siege of Syracuse. The city was heavily defended, but one of its greatest defenses wasn't a wall. It was Archimedes. He designed machines that could launch enormous stones at approaching soldiers. He developed powerful defensive mechanisms, and according to ancient accounts, he even designed machines capable of grabbing enemy ships and lifting them out of the water. Some of the more dramatic stories about his inventions may have been exaggerated over time. But the Romans clearly discovered that attacking Syracuse was much harder than they expected. Roman soldiers approached the walls. Projectiles came flying down. Ships moved toward the city. Mechanical devices attacked them. The Romans were fighting an enemy they could barely see. And behind some of those defenses was a mathematician. Archimedes wasn't a general standing on the walls with a sword. His battlefield was mathematics. He understood geometry, mechanics, levers, balance, and the movement of objects. And he turned that knowledge into weapons. The siege lasted for years. Rome couldn't simply walk into Syracuse. The city's defenses were too effective, and Archimedes had helped turn the city into a mechanical nightmare for the attackers. But eventually the Romans found a way inside. Syracuse fell in 212 BC. The city descended into chaos. Roman soldiers were moving through the streets. People were being killed. Buildings were being looted. And somewhere inside all of this chaos was Archimedes. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Archimedes was sitting in the middle of his work. He had drawn geometric figures in the sand. He was completely focused on a mathematical problem. The city around him had essentially collapsed. But Archimedes was still working. A Roman soldier approached him and ordered him to come with him. But Archimedes apparently refused. His attention was on the figures in front of him. He reportedly said, "Do not disturb my circles." The soldier wasn't impressed. Archimedes still didn't move, and the situation ended with the Roman soldier killing him. The exact details are uncertain. Other ancient accounts give different versions of his final moments. Some say he was carrying mathematical instruments. Others suggest he was mistaken for someone else. So we can't know exactly what happened in his final seconds. But the story became legendary. Imagine the scene. An entire city has fallen. An army has finally broken through. People are running through the streets. Smoke and destruction are everywhere. And one of the greatest mathematicians in history is sitting on the ground, drawing shapes in the sand. He apparently cared more about solving the problem in front of him than the army surrounding him. And there is something strangely fitting about that. Archimedes spent his entire life trying to understand how the world worked. He studied geometry, mechanics, physics, engineering. He created machines that changed warfare. He explored the principles of buoyancy and the movement of objects. He developed ideas that would influence mathematics and science for centuries. But in the end, he wasn't killed while operating one of those machines. He wasn't leading an army. He wasn't trying to escape. He was simply working. A Roman soldier saw an old man drawing circles. Archimedes saw a problem that needed solving. And unfortunately for him, the Roman soldier wasn't interested in mathematics. There is also an incredible irony in the fact that Archimedes had helped defend Syracuse against the Roman army for so long. He had made himself one of the most important figures in the city's resistance. Yet when the city finally fell, his greatest weapon couldn't save him. No equation could stop a sword. No machine could protect him from a soldier standing directly in front of him. His mind had helped keep an entire army away from the city. But in the final moment, he was just one man. Archimedes therefore earns number 3. Because his death became a symbol of something unusual. A man so devoted to knowledge that, even at the moment his world was collapsing around him, his attention remained on the work in front of him. Number 2. Pyrrhus of Epirus. Now we're moving from mathematics to war. And Pyrrhus was one of the most dangerous warriors of the ancient world. He was the king of Epirus. He commanded armies. He invaded kingdoms. And he became famous for fighting the Romans. Pyrrhus was a brilliant military commander. He even studied the tactics of Alexander the Great and tried to build his own reputation as another great conqueror. And for a while it worked. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus crossed into Italy with an army that included infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. Yes, war elephants. The Romans had never seen anything quite like them. The animals terrified Roman soldiers and disrupted their formations. Imagine being a Roman soldier who had spent his life preparing to fight men with swords and spears. Then suddenly, enormous elephants come charging toward you. Pyrrhus defeated the Romans at the Battle of Heraclea. Then in 279 BC, he defeated another Roman army at Asculum. But there was a problem. His victories were costing him enormous numbers of soldiers. After the Battle of Asculum, ancient sources attribute a famous statement to him. If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. That is where we get the phrase, Pyrrhic victory, a victory that costs so much that it almost becomes a defeat. And that phrase is one of the most important things Pyrrhus left behind. Because winning wasn't enough. A commander could win the battlefield and still destroy his own army. And Pyrrhus was beginning to discover exactly how expensive his ambition could be. But Pyrrhus didn't stop. His ambition kept pushing him into new wars. He wanted glory. He wanted territory. He wanted to build a kingdom worthy of his ambitions. Eventually, he returned to Greece and became involved in a conflict over the city of Argos. In 272 BC, Pyrrhus entered Argos during a chaotic night battle. The city was filled with narrow streets. Soldiers were fighting in darkness. Commands were difficult to hear. The entire battlefield had turned into confusion. Men were fighting from rooftops and streets. Units became separated. Nobody could easily tell where the enemy was. And Pyrrhus was right in the middle of it. This was a man who had fought Romans. He had fought Greek armies. He had crossed mountains with elephants. He had survived countless battles. But now his final enemy was something much more ordinary. A roof tile. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, an Argive woman was watching the fighting from above. She saw Pyrrhus below. She recognized him, and she decided to attack. She grabbed a heavy roof tile. Then she threw it down. The tile struck Pyrrhus in the neck. The great warrior was stunned. For a moment, the man who had terrified entire armies was vulnerable. An enemy soldier saw what had happened. He attacked Pyrrhus, and the king was killed. Think about how strange that ending is. Pyrrhus had spent his entire life fighting armies. He had defeated Roman legions. He had led cavalry charges. He had commanded war elephants. He had crossed into foreign lands. He had survived battles that destroyed thousands of other men. He had dreams of building a massive kingdom. And after surviving all of that, he was killed in a chaotic street fight after being struck by something thrown from a rooftop. Of course, historians cannot verify every dramatic detail of the story. Ancient writers often included memorable details in their accounts. But Pyrrhus really did die during the fighting at Argos in 272 BC. And the irony is almost perfect. A man who became famous for military victories eventually became famous for one of the strangest deaths of the ancient world. He wanted glory. He wanted territory. He wanted to become one of the greatest conquerors of his age. Instead, history remembered him for something else. A Pyrrhic victory and a roof tile. There's also something almost poetic about his death. Pyrrhus spent his life trying to control events. He studied warfare. He planned campaigns. He moved armies across countries. He calculated when to attack and when to retreat. But his final moment wasn't decided by a brilliant military maneuver. It was chaos. A piece of tile came from above. One unpredictable moment changed everything. And that is often how history works. The people who seem almost impossible to defeat can sometimes be brought down by the smallest and most unexpected events. Pyrrhus therefore earns number 2. Because if you're going to spend your entire life fighting armies, you'd probably expect your final moment to be slightly more dignified. Number 1. Harald Hardrada. Now we reach one of the most spectacular deaths of the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada was the king of Norway. And his life sounds almost too incredible to be real. He wasn't simply a king who inherited a throne. He was a warrior, a commander, a traveler, a mercenary, and eventually one of the most powerful men in Scandinavia. As a young man, Harald fought in Norway. After losing a battle, he fled the country. But instead of disappearing into history, he traveled across Europe and eventually reached the Byzantine Empire. There he served in the famous Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was an elite military force that protected the Byzantine emperor. Harald fought in campaigns across distant lands and gained enormous military experience. He also became extremely wealthy and experienced. Eventually, Harald returned to Scandinavia. He became king of Norway. But even being king wasn't enough. He wanted England. And in 1066, England was vulnerable. King Edward the Confessor had died. Harold Godwinson became king. But several men believed they had a claim to the English throne. One of them was Harald Hardrada. So Harold gathered an enormous army. He sailed across the North Sea and invaded England. In September 1066, Harold's forces defeated an English army at the Battle of Fulford near York. Things were looking extremely good for him. He had landed in England. He had defeated the English. York was under threat, and it seemed possible that Harold might actually become King of England. But then something happened that changed everything. King Harold Godwinson reacted incredibly quickly. He gathered his army in southern England. Then he marched north, hundreds of kilometers. His soldiers had to travel enormous distances to confront the Norwegian invasion. This was an exhausting march. But Harold understood that he couldn't give Harold time to strengthen his position. Harald Hardrada wasn't expecting the English army to arrive so quickly. On September 25, 1066, the two armies met at Stamford Bridge. The battle became one of the most famous clashes in English history. The Norwegian army had been caught off guard. Many soldiers were not wearing their full armor. But Harald wasn't hiding. He was at the front of the battle. He was fighting alongside his men. According to later accounts, Harald fought with extraordinary ferocity. The battle itself was brutal. The English army had marched a huge distance to get there, and now thousands of soldiers were fighting at close range. The Norwegian invasion had gone from looking like a possible conquest of England to a desperate struggle for survival. And then during the chaos, an arrow struck Harald in the throat. Harald Hardrada fell. The Viking king was dead. His army continued fighting. But without their commander, the invasion began to collapse. The English eventually defeated the Norwegian army. Harald's dream of conquering England was over. But the story of 1066 wasn't finished. Because King Harald Godwinson had just defeated one invasion. Another was coming. Across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, had gathered his own army. And William invaded England shortly afterward. Harald now had to do something almost unbelievable. He had to march his exhausted army south again. The same king who had just fought and defeated Harald Hardrada now had to fight another invading army. On October 14, 1066, the English and Norman armies met at the Battle of Hastings. Harald was defeated. William became King of England. And England's history changed forever. So look at what happened in just a few weeks. Harald Hardrada invaded England. He defeated an English army. He marched toward York. Harald Godwinson rushed north. Harald was killed at Stamford Bridge. Harald then marched south. William invaded. Harald was killed at Hastings. And William conquered England. All of this happened in the same year. 1066. It is difficult to find another year in medieval English history packed with so many major events. And Harald's death was the first major event in a chain that would transform the English monarchy, language, culture, and aristocracy. But what makes Harald's death especially epic is the life that came before it. He had fought across Europe. He had served a foreign emperor. He had commanded elite soldiers. He had become a king. And when he finally saw an opportunity to claim another crown, he personally led an invasion. He came remarkably close. But at Stamford Bridge, an arrow ended everything. One moment he was leading an army. The next he was lying on the battlefield. And his death became the end of the Viking invasion of England. Harald Hardrada therefore earns number 1. Not because his death was the strangest. Not because it was the most brutal. But because it was the final chapter of an extraordinary warrior's life. A Viking king, a massive invasion, a desperate battle, an arrow, and a kingdom that would soon be conquered by someone else. So there you have it. 3 of the most epic deaths in history. Archimedes, a brilliant mathematician who supposedly refused to abandon his work while his city was falling around him. Pyrrhus, a legendary warrior who survived countless battles, only to die during chaotic street fighting after being struck by a roof tile. In Harald Hardrada, the Viking king who invaded England, fought at the front of his army and died from an arrow at Stamford Bridge. 3 completely different deaths. One died thinking about mathematics. One died in the chaos of a city battle. And one died trying to conquer a kingdom. But all 3 became part of history. And that's what makes these stories so fascinating. Power doesn't make you immortal. Brilliant minds can die suddenly. Great warriors can fall in unexpected ways. And even kings can lose everything in a single moment. Their lives ended hundreds or even thousands of years ago. But their stories survived. And perhaps that's the most epic part of all. Because long after the battles ended, the kingdoms disappeared, and the people who witnessed these events turned to dust, were still here telling their stories. And that's the strange thing about history. Sometimes the ending of a person's life becomes almost as famous as the life itself. Archimedes is remembered not only for the discoveries he made, but for the image of a mathematician refusing to leave his circles. Pyrrhus is remembered not only for his victories, but for the phrase his victories created and the bizarre circumstances of his final battle. And Harald Hardrada is remembered not only as a Viking king, but as the man whose invasion of England ended dramatically at Stamford Bridge. Their deaths didn't erase what they accomplished. They became part of their legends. And centuries later, those final moments still feel almost impossible to believe. 3 men, 3 completely different worlds, 3 completely different endings. But each one left behind a story that refused to die.